Chapter 32. The King is Dead. The small blast knocked AZ off the edge of the hole in the shipping container. From the cursing and agonized moaning, Jim could tell the chaff hadn't killed the red-headed scumbag instantly. It took another 2 long, slow drags through the debris for Jim to reach the edge of the container with his single stump of an arm. What was left of the robot's elbow allowed him to hook the edge of the hole and drag himself up. When he could finally see what was left of AZ, it wasn't pretty. While still bodily intact and missing no limbs, the left side of AZ's face was shredded. It didn't look like he had a left eye or ear anymore. His signature dyed red hair was almost entirely missing from the left side of his head. AZ was stumbling around, crazed with rage and pain, and blood was leaking from everywhere. As he already wore so much red, it wasn't easy to tell in the dim light, but the sheer wetness was impossible to miss. Fine jets of blood were spraying out in quick, regular intervals from all over his neck and head. AZ finally stopped staggering for a moment, dropped his arms, stood straight upright, and started to scream, "Franki! Franki!" Then his eyes rolled back up into his head, and he slammed down on both knees, followed rather quickly by a solid face-first head plant into the ship's deck. Jim didn't move at all. This wasn't the satisfaction he had hoped for. It was just sad, a sick child meeting his untimely end. Out of nowhere, Franki appeared. In all of the chaos, had he been there the entire time? He rushed over to AZ's side and lifted the dying psycho up from a rapidly pooling puddle of his own blood. Franki was not even remotely himself. This was a man panicked and crying. He cradled AZ in his arms, AZ's single remaining eye staring lifelessly into the night. For someone who seemed entirely devoid of feelings, what poured out of him at that moment was tremendous loss. It was heartbreaking. "No, God, no!" cried out the suddenly very emotional Franki as he clutched AZ to his chest. Then, in a moment Jim wouldn't have guessed in a million years, Franki leaned down and gently kissed AZ on the lips. Suddenly, everything Franki did up until that moment made sense. Then he looked up to see Jim's metal head poking over the top of the container, looking back at him. The rage that filled him was demonic. Franki gently laid the bloody punk down without breaking eye contact with Jim for even a moment. Then he stood up, with machine gun in hand, and just emptied the entire clip into Jim's robotic face. At least 20 bullets hammered the robot's face, although none had any effect at all. Jim didn't move, not that he could, and just tilted his head down slightly to help deflect the blows. Franki ejected the clip, slammed another one in he had, and did the same thing again. Bam, bam, bam! Another 30 rounds slammed into the robotic head with no effect. Then Franki pulled out a very large revolver from out of nowhere and emptied all 6 rounds into Jim's robotic head. Each hit like a hammer, but only left the slightest of dents. Franki then threw the revolver at Jim, which bounced off harmlessly. Then he took the butt of the rifle and started slamming it in Jim's head. "Give him back! Give him back!" cried out Franki in tears and fury. While Jim's tank-like body was unaffected by Franki's wrath, the gun was not so invulnerable, and after the 20th blow it just shattered. Franki threw down the broken gun, grabbed a pipe out of the scattered metal debris, and just started smashing it down on the damaged juggernaut. None of these damaged Jim's robotic body. The only thing painful was the look of mind-numbing loss on Franki's face. Jim actually felt sorry for the monster. Even the devil is loved by someone. Jim couldn't bring himself to stop Franki. As much as he didn't want to, he felt the pangs of regret savagely assault his sense of accomplishment, ripping at his victory like a wood chipper mulching a tree. As Franki was about to strike Jim's robotic body, for the 4th or 5th dozenth time, there was a pop from overhead. A spray of blood and gore burst from the side of Franki's head, and he crumpled over. Jim couldn't see where the shooter was, but Franki fell on his side, wide-eyed and instantly dead. From all of the noise of Franki's anguish-filled assault, neither him nor Jim had noticed the high-pitched squeal of a drone hovering above them. Free of the loud attacks, Jim looked up to see a lawnmower-size, black little craft with a gun mechanism tucked underneath. The gun-packing drone descended to Jim and turned on its lights. Through the glare, Jim heard a familiar voice. "Hey, Jim, looks like we got both of them," cheerfully said a slightly better-sounding Mr. Carvel. "Yeah," said Jim somberly. Any joy that might have brought him was now ash in his mouth. "Looks like you've seen better days. I'm gonna go break the good news to everyone. You hang tight," said Mr. Carvel over the drone's speaker. Then the drone turned its light to the bodies of Franki and AZ and flew up a few feet. Moments later, over the gunfire below, the booming voice of Mr. Carvel radiated out from half a dozen such drones flying all over the shipyard. It announced, "Take a good look, boys and girls. "Your leaders are dead. The Bloody Eye Rebellion is over." While Jim couldn't see it from his vantage point, barely hanging out of a shattered cargo container, the other drones started projecting the video the first drone had captured on every wall and building they could. Instantly, everyone in the shipyard and beyond could see the corpses of Franki and AZ. Quickly, the gunfire stopped, followed by the hasty scattering of what remained of the Bloody Eye. A few shots came and went as the punks all fled as quickly as they could, with Mr. Carvel's men in hot pursuit. Some tried to surrender, but were instead executed on the spot. There was a lot of begging and pleading below, none of which stopped their inevitable end. Jim could only barely hear the cries of the massacre below, but in the bright light of the drone just above him, he could clearly see the bodies of Franki and AZ. Jim let go of the side of the container, which he only barely held onto with the robotic body's one remaining stump. He slid down the other side of the hole, mortified by what he'd been a part of. This wasn't the heroic ending he wanted. Then the fog of Franki's sad ending cleared, and Jim remembered why he was here in the first place. Jim turned and once again hooked the lip of the hole in the cargo container. Pulling with what was left of the robot's elbow, Jim tore down the edge of the hole and looked over to the cargo container in the back. Resting on its edge was Sarah's case, right where he left it. Jim could only thank God Franki didn't take notice of the small and unprotected box. For the third time that night, Sarah narrowly avoided death. Jim collapsed on his back. A short time later, Mr. Carvel's men appeared. They were far too weak to move the remains of Jim's robotic body, but he motioned over to Sarah's case with his remaining stump. After a little climbing just to reach it, they took the case down and over to Jim. While she still lacked a speaker through which to talk, her living visage allowed Jim to finally relax. Jim triggered the release on the spherical chest, allowing the incredibly scarred hatch that protected his neural encasement to open. Jim was dumped back into his virtual room. Just to get inside the suit, Nate had to remove the screen and camera that had long given him a window into the real world. In its place, Matthew provided a small camera module, so Jim wasn't entirely blind to the world. He was able to watch as Mr. Carvel's man lifted his case out of the suit, and they took both himself and Sarah off the dry-docked boat that had provided them both with such misery. Jim hoped he'd never see that damn boat again. Jim and Sarah's cases were hurried through the shipyard and quickly loaded into the back of a substantial-looking car. The thick glass and solid frame suggested it was probably bulletproof. Jim could barely see anything through the front window as the driver and another man with a large gun got into the front seats. They seemed to be terrified, though. There was shouting and gunfire outside that seemed to be getting closer. "No, we're done! There can't be anyone left," said Jim as he watched from his virtual room. The car was just in the process of driving away when a large concrete barrier flew out and crashed in front of them. The driver quickly changed gears and turned in his seat in an attempt to back away quickly, but another loud crash had Jim guessing a second barrier had impacted behind them. Outside, some gunfire was directed back into the shipyard, and a few voices shouted something about, "It's coming this way!" The car Jim and Sarah were in quickly moved forward and back, attempting to shimmy its way out of the barriers blocking its path, when a large robotic hand appeared and tore a hole through the car's hood. A moment later, it pulled out the engine block and tossed it to the side. The man in the driver's side, facing away from the robot, leapt out of the door and ran, quickly followed by the man in the passenger seat. Finally, a voice boomed from the robot. "Okay, nobody's leaving here with Jim and Sarah until I talk to the man in charge," said Matthew.